All right, welcome back everyone to our fourth endocrine lecture. We're now going to start moving away from the brain, the hypothalamus and pituitary. Although we are still going to be talking about them, we're going to move the focus now down towards the neck and begin talking about the thyroid gland and the parathyroid glands. But before we get rolling with the new material, let's handle our not really attendance questions. What is the function of TRH? Where is it synthesized? What is the function of TSH? Where is it synthesized? And what cells are responsible for creation of new calcified bone tissue? So go ahead and try to answer those. And let's see what the correct answers are. The function of TRH, thyrotropin releasing hormone. Its function is to stimulate the release of TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone, or thyrotropin, from the anterior pituitary. Where is it synthesized? It's synthesized in the hypothalamus. What's the function of TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone, or thyrotropin? Its function is to stimulate the thyroid follicles to release thyroid hormones, T3 and T4. Where is it synthesized? It is synthesized in the anterior pituitary. And what cells are responsible for creation of new calcified bone tissue? This goes back to Bio 137. So back in the skeletal system, the cells that are responsible for creation of new calcified bone tissue are osteoblasts. Osteoblasts take uncalcified bone, which is essentially cartilage, and they calcify it. See that chart that we were looking at last class. Up at the top, we see the hypothalamus, and then it releases various tropic hormones which stimulate the anterior pituitary to release its own hormones. Some of those go off to have effects on the body. Some of them are tropic hormones themselves that go to another gland, which is what we will see today. And then that gland releases its set of hormones, which will go on to have effects on the body. Now, before we get going, I want to talk about certain types of disorders that interfere with some of these hormones and glands, and something that we can kind of tell about what type of disorder it is. And we're going to see this today with the thyroid gland, and again next class when we talk about the adrenal gland. In some instances, maybe the anterior pituitary has a problem and it doesn't release, let's just say, thyroid stimulating hormone. Well, if it doesn't release thyroid stimulating hormone, which is the stimulus for thyroid to release T3, T4, then TSH would be low in the blood. But additionally, T3 and T4 would also be low in the blood, and that would be a type of hypothyroidism. On the other hand, maybe we have too much TSH being released from the anterior pituitary. If we had too much TSH being released, there would be too much TSH in the blood, and the thyroid would be releasing too much T3, T4, so there would be too much T3, T4 in the blood. So that would be hyperthyroidism. So we can look at levels of T3 and T4 in the blood and see if they are high or low, which tells us if we have hyper or hypothyroidism. And then we can backtrace that and see, is it a problem with the thyroid or is it a problem with the anterior pituitary? Because like we just saw, if TSH is too high or if TSH is too low, that's the anterior pituitary that's misbehaving. And that's the reason for the hyper or hypothyroidism, leading to too much or too little T3, T4. But there's another possibility. Maybe the anterior pituitary is releasing just the right amount of TSH, but the thyroid is misbehaving. Maybe the thyroid just starts making too much T3, T4, or it stops making enough T3, T4, even though the levels of TSH are normal. Well, in that case, it's not the anterior pituitary gland that's misbehaving, it's the thyroid gland that's misbehaving. The same thing could go if we were talking about the adrenal gland, instead of anterior pituitary TSH, thyroid T3, T4, here we would say anterior pituitary gland, ACTH, adrenal cortex, and then all of its associated hormones. So what we run into when there's this long domino effect is it makes it difficult to know which gland is misbehaving. Maybe it's the thyroid gland or the adrenal cortex. Maybe it's the anterior pituitary. How do we know? Well, we check the blood to see how much T3, T4 is there in the case of thyroid. And then we compare that, how much TSH is there. And we can narrow it down. So let's just say we draw someone's blood and their T3, T4 is elevated. They have high T3, T4. They have hyperthyroidism. And then we look to see their TSH. Well, their TSH levels are normal. They are either exactly where we would expect or low, because in that case, we should not be stimulating the thyroid at that point. If TSH levels are normal, which would be low, and T3, T4 are high, think about what that tells us. Where is the problem? Is that a problem with the anterior pituitary, or is that a problem with the thyroid? In that case, that is a problem with the thyroid, because T3, T4 are high. We backtrack and look at the TSH. It's not high, so we're not stimulating the thyroid to make excess T3, T4. The thyroid is doing that on its own. So the problem is with the thyroid. Let's say there's another patient and we check their T3, T4, and we see that their T3, T4 is high. So we backtrack and we check their blood again and we see their TSH is also high. Where's the problem? Well, here the problem is with the anterior pituitary. Because as we will see today, and as we kind of mentioned last time, the feedback loop goes hypothalamus releases its hormone, tells the anterior pituitary to release its hormone, and in this case tells the thyroid to release its hormones, which feed back and cut off the hypothalamus and anterior pituitary. But what we're seeing here is anterior pituitary is making too much TSH, telling the thyroid to make more T3, T4. T3, T4 levels rise, so it feeds back and tells the hypothalamus and anterior pituitary to stop making their hormones. But the anterior pituitary continues to make too much TSH, which continues to tell the thyroid to make more T3, T4, which continues to go higher and higher. So in that case, the problem is with the anterior pituitary. So first thing we do is look to see the bottom hormone. Is it too high? Is it too low? Is it just right? If it's either too high or too low, backtrack. Look to see what is the anterior pituitary gland doing. Is it making too much, too little, or just enough? And then based on those two levels, we can say the problem is with the thyroid or the problem is with the anterior pituitary. We could do the same thing over here with the adrenal cortex or the anterior pituitary. So when we have hyperthyroidism or hypothyroidism, and next class when we start talking about hyper and hyposecretions at the adrenal gland, if it's a problem with the thyroid or the adrenal gland, so if it's a problem with the bottom of this chart, we say that it is a primary disorder. So primary hyperthyroidism or primary hypothyroidism. But if it's a problem with the anterior pituitary gland, It's a secondary condition. So that would be secondary hyperthyroidism or secondary hypothyroidism. That tells us, yes, the thyroid is making too much or too little, but it's because of the anterior pituitary gland. Now, if you pay really close attention to this chart, you can kind of think, well, maybe the problem's with the hypothalamus. And that's true. It could be a problem with the hypothalamus, in which case we would call it a tertiary condition, but we will not go that far in this class. In this class, what we're going to be talking about is primary and secondary, so thyroid, anterior pituitary, or adrenal cortex, anterior pituitary. So keep that in mind. We will kind of refer back to that a couple of times in this class. So now we're going to move on and talk about the thyroid gland, and then we're going to talk about the parathyroid gland. So what we see here, there's two diagrams. This diagram over on the right is on page 636 in your textbook. The diagrams over on the left are on page 639 in your textbook. So let's talk first about the thyroid gland, and it's found right below your larynx, right below your Adam's apple. So right in the front of your throat, it wraps around the front of your trachea, the windpipe. It doesn't wrap completely around, as we will see in just a little bit. It wraps around the front, but it does not completely wrap around the back. So here we're looking at an anterior view. This is the front of someone's neck that we're seeing. And this structure right here is the thyroid gland. And the thyroid gland has two lobes, one on each side of the trachea, and it's connected by this smaller, thinner area called the isthmus. Isthmus is just a connecting piece. So here we also see the thyroid kind of isolated from everything else. Here are the two lobes and the isthmus. And then what we see here in the middle, this is the microscopic view. So this is one of the slides that you have to know for lab, but you also need to know a little bit about this structure for lecture. Now, when we look at the thyroid gland in microscopic view, there are some very large structures that kind of stand out, very obvious. These large, kind of roundish structures, these are called follicles. So the thyroid gland is made of many, many follicles if we look at it microscopically. And if we look at these follicles, they are surrounded by a layer of simple cuboidal epithelium. Now, those cells are called follicular cells. Follicular cells surround and create the border of the follicles. The follicles are filled with this kind of thick liquid called stroma or colloid. Colloid, I believe, is a little more common, but you may also see stroma. And the stroma is filled, or the colloid is filled with iodine and something called thyroglobulin. And here, this is where the thyroglobulin and the iodine come together to make two separate hormones, T3 and T4. Collectively, they are called thyroid hormone. We will talk about those in just a minute. We can also see these other cells that are kind of in between the follicles, and typically they don't take stain very well. They kind of appear clear or white. These are called parafollicular cells, or C cells. The C stands for clear cells. Now, the parafollicular cells and the follicular cells do two completely different things. So really, the thyroid gland, it's kind of like it's two separate glands. The parafollicular cells, we're going to talk about in just a little bit, and the follicular cells, which form the border, they create that colloid or the stroma, and they create that T3 and T4 thyroid hormone, which is what we're going to talk about now. So first let's talk about T3. T3 is also called triiodothyronine. Triiodothyronine, you don't need to know that. T4 is called thyroxine, and that should sound very familiar because we mentioned thyroxine back in the cardiovascular chapter. Now, T3 and T4 are both being made, but a lot more T4 is made. T4 is much more abundant, but T3 is much more active. More of the cells in our body respond to T3 compared to T4. But that's kind of not really the case, because since we make more T4, then more T4 is in circulation, the thyroxine. If it gets to a cell that doesn't really respond to T4, then that target cell simply cuts one of the iodines off. And that's really the only difference in T3, T4. The 3, all that tells us is there are 3 iodines attached. The 4, all that tells us is there are 4 iodines attached. So if I take a T4 to a target cell that doesn't respond to T4, then that target cell cuts an iodine off, and that T4 is now T3, and that cell can respond to it. So really, T3, T4, we're going to lump them together and just call them thyroid hormone, and we're going to talk about the effects of thyroid hormone rather than T3 or T4 individually. So we've already said that the stimulus for thyroid hormone is TSH, and it is inhibited by a lack of TSH. Now, right over here on the right, this actually might have even been something that you saw back in Bio 137 briefly, but here is what we were just talking about on the previous slide. Here's the hypothalamus releasing TRH. Now the anterior pituitary responds by releasing TSH. The thyroid responds by releasing thyroid hormone, which does 2 things. It goes off and it has its effect on the bodies, and it feeds back as a negative feedback loop to tell the hypothalamus to stop releasing TRH, and it tells the anterior pituitary to stop releasing TSH. Classic negative feedback loop. Now, its function. We're not going to go into every single function because there are hundreds of them, but we can group them all together really, really nicely and talk about kind of collectively what those functions are. And it all comes down to transcription of proteins. The thyroid gland stimulates protein transcription. And we can kind of lump that together into 3 separate things. When we are transcribing proteins, it increases the calorigenic effect. Well, calorigenic effect is the result of increased metabolism. If we are having increased metabolism, then we're going to get warmer. Remember, metabolism generates heat. That's all that calorigenic effect means. When your metabolic rate goes up, when there are more reactions happening in your body, heat is produced as a byproduct, and you warm up. That's the calorigenic effect. That's one of those functions. Another, development and growth. This is much more important in developing embryos and young people. The thyroid is very responsible for development and growth during childhood and adolescence and when still in the womb. And also blood pressure regulation. As I said just a moment ago, think back to the cardiovascular chapter when we talked about thyroxine and blood pressure. Go back and review your blood pressure chart if you don't remember that. But those 3 things together, increased metabolic rate and the calorigenic effect, development and growth, blood pressure regulation, those are the kind of areas that collectively fall under that transcription of protein. Those things all are responsible, or what the thyroid gland is responsible for. So that's, if you think about that, that's pretty much everything in the body. And if you have or you know someone that has either hyperthyroidism or hypothyroidism, you know it can have effects all over the body, from weight to skin to feeling fatigued or feeling very full of energy. It can have effects all over your body. So let's talk about some disorders. Hypersecretion. You can have just general hyperthyroidism, as we saw just a moment ago, because either the pituitary is making too much TSH or the thyroid is just making too much T3, T4. But there's a type of hyperthyroidism that I want to talk about called Graves' disease. And Graves' disease is a really weird kind of autoimmune disease that results from an antibody that kind of is misshapen. And it's misshapen in a way that it resembles thyroid stimulating hormone. Well, think about proteins. How do they do their job? It's all based on shape. So if one protein is shaped really similar to another protein, they can work the same. So the result of that is that antibody starts to function the same way TSH does. What does TSH do? It tells the thyroid to make T3, T4. So this antibody is stimulating the thyroid. That causes increased metabolism. It causes things like weight loss. It causes tachycardia, a fast heartbeat. It causes nervousness, that feeling of stress. It causes weight loss, like I just mentioned. It causes something called exophthalmos, which is bulgy eyes. The eyes seem like they're bulging out of the skull. And it can be treated by either removing the thyroid entirely or by injecting radioactive iodine. Well, if you inject radioactive iodine, the only thing in the body that uses iodine is the thyroid. Radioactive iodine will be taken up by the thyroid, and those follicles will be killed off by the radioactive iodine. So that cuts off any ability to respond to that weird-shaped antibody. Now, real quick, I want to go over wrong one. I want to go over to our whiteboard and look at how that would actually look. So here's our normal feedback loop. Hypothalamus releases TRH, tells the anterior pituitary to release TSH, tells the thyroid to release T3, T4. T3, T4 levels rise, which then feeds back, cuts off the TRH and the TSH. But let's draw that weird-shaped antibody. You know, it's shaped kind of like TSH. So if it's shaped like TSH, it can do the same job as TSH. So it stimulates the thyroid. Well, now the thyroid starts making T3, T4. It feeds back. It tells the hypothalamus, stop releasing TRH. So it does. It feeds back. It tells the anterior pituitary, stop releasing TSH. So it does. Meanwhile, the thyroid keeps making T3, T4 because of that weird-shaped antibody. So T3, T4 levels rise, feeds back to the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary, says, okay, stop making your hormones, and the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary are all, I'm not making any hormones, but the thyroid keeps being stimulated. Well, let's go back to our slideshow, and something that happens when someone has hyperthyroidism because of Graves' disease, they get something called a goiter, which is what we see down here. It's a very large, swollen mass that results from an enlarged thyroid gland. So goiter results from overstimulation of the thyroid follicles. And that's exactly what we're doing. Even though the anterior pituitary isn't telling the thyroid to make T3, T4, that antibody is making the thyroid make T3, T4, so we're overstimulating the thyroid follicles, and we can get goiter. So that's one type of hyperthyroidism parathyroidism. Let's talk about hypothyroidism. You can get something called myxedema. Now, there's lots of different types of hypothyroidism, but we're going to talk about some of the things that that they all have in common. So sometimes you can get goiter, which doesn't seem to make sense, because if we're not having the thyroid work a lot, why would we get hypothyroidism leading to goiter? Well, let's think about our drawing again. Instead of the antibody, let's see what happens in some types of hypothyroidism. The thyroid stops making T3, T4. T3, T4 levels are down because the thyroid has something wrong with it. So we do not feed back. We do not tell the earlier glands to stop making their hormones. So instead of going away, TRH levels rise, and that tells the anterior pituitary to make TSH, which rises, which tells the thyroid to make T3, T4. But if the thyroid has something wrong with it, it's not able to make T3, T4. So there's no feedback, and the hypothalamus makes more TRH, telling the anterior pituitary to make more TSH, telling the thyroid to make T3, T4, which still doesn't rise. No feedback. We keep making more TRH, we keep making more TSH, we keep stimulating the thyroid, no T3, T4. So, if we look here, is this a primary or a secondary disorder? Think about that before we go any further. This is a primary disorder because we are stimulating the thyroid to make T3, T4, but it's not responding. Here it's the thyroid. It's a primary condition. The anterior pituitary is doing exactly what we would expect it to do. The thyroid is not responding. But why would we get goiter out of this? What did we say caused goiter? Overstimulation of the thyroid follicles. That's what we're doing. The thyroid isn't responding, but we keep stimulating it and stimulating it and stimulating it, and nothing happens. But that overstimulation, whether or not we get T3, T4, overstimulation of the follicles is what leads to goiter, which is what we see there. So goiter in hyposecretion from the thyroid, the pituitary continues to produce TSH, trying to raise the T3, T4 thyroid hormone. This leads to overstimulation of follicles, resulting in goiter. Well, there's another thing that we can tie into this. Why might the thyroid stop making thyroid hormone if it's being prompted to? Could be any number of reasons, but one thing that we used to see was a lot of goiters because people weren't getting enough iodine in their diet. So it took a while to figure it out, but they thought, well, iodine seems to be the issue. So if someone doesn't have enough iodine, their thyroid can't make T3, T4. They will still be stimulated. They'll get goiter, and goiter used to be much more common than it is now. So they thought, how can we make sure that everyone gets iodine? What's something that everybody in the United States eats? Well, salt. Everybody eats salt all the time. So what do you see when you pick up your thing of salt that you bought at the grocery store? It always says iodized salt. If you've ever wondered why they would put iodine in salt, that's your reason. This was shortly after World War I. It was in the earlier mid-20s, I believe, when they started putting iodine in salt. And the reason was to get rid of hypothyroidism-related goiters. And that's exactly what happened. Once they started putting iodine in salt, goiters practically vanished. All right, So now let's switch gears a little bit. Let's look at those parafollicular cells, or C cells. Here, the stimulus is unrelated to the anterior pituitary. This you probably talked about back in Bio 137. The stimulus is actually an increase in blood calcium. When blood calcium levels rise, then we get calcitonin being released. It's inhibited by a drop in blood calcium. When blood calcium levels drop, then the calcitonin stops being released. So what is the function of calcitonin? It lowers blood calcium and it lowers blood phosphate by moving both of those into bone. How does it do that? Well, it's going to focus the osteoblasts that we talked about earlier and the osteoclasts. Remember, osteoclasts are cells that break bone down. So what does calcitonin do here? In osteoblasts, it increases their activity. It makes them build bone a lot faster. Well, what are the ingredients of bone? Things like calcium, phosphate salts, magnesium, things like that. So if osteoblasts are going at a higher rate, building bone faster, they're going to pull those ingredients for bone out of the blood. They're going to pull calcium and phosphate out of the blood and pack it away in the bone that they're building. Calcitonin also decreases osteoclast activity. We don't want them to break bone down right now because that would spill calcium out into the blood and cause blood calcium to go up. That is not what we want in this case. So calcitonin increases osteoblast activity and decreases osteoclast activity. The result is calcitonin lowers blood calcium and blood phosphate. Okay, now moving away from the thyroid a little bit, all we've done is just gone around the back. We can still see the thyroid gland here. We're looking at the back, the posterior side. We can see here's the trachea, and just behind the trachea is the esophagus. Here's the thyroid that's wrapping around. Remember, I said it doesn't meet in the back. It almost does, but it doesn't completely wrap around. And on the back of the thyroid gland are 4, sometimes as many as 8 little nodules called the parathyroid glands. And that's what we see here in this image on the right in the microscopic image. This is on page 640 of your textbook. So, parathyroid glands, they're located on the posterior surface, the back surface of the thyroid. Typically there's 4, you can have as many as 8 of them. And I love this one because it's so self-explanatory. What do the parathyroid glands release? They release parathyroid hormone, PTH. Now, even though calcitonin does play a role in blood calcium, it doesn't significantly affect blood calcium in reality. Really, it's the parathyroid hormone that plays the biggest role in blood calcium levels. So, what does the parathyroid hormone do and how does it do it? Its stimulus is low blood calcium, and it is inhibited by high blood calcium. That is exactly the opposite of calcitonin. Its function is to raise blood calcium, the opposite of calcitonin, and lower blood phosphate, the same as calcitonin. So that's going to be a little bit weird. How can it have half of the same effect and half of the opposite effect of calcitonin? Well, it actually does it in a few steps. So let's look to see step by step what happens. At the bones, when we look at those bone cells, parathyroid hormone increases osteoclast activity and decreases osteoblast activity. The exact opposite of calcitonin. So here we start to see bone get broken down. Now that's not necessarily a bad thing. Remember back in 137, bone is constantly being rebuilt. We're getting rid of some bone, we're building new bone, we have bone resorption and bone deposition. So this is normal, this isn't a bad thing. But we have osteoclast activity increased, breaking bone down, and when that happens, calcium and phosphate spill out into the blood, and both blood calcium and blood phosphate levels increase. Now, this is actually only temporary. We have an increase in blood calcium and an increase in blood phosphate. Once that's out in circulation, we get to the kidneys. The kidneys filter the calcium and phosphate out of the blood. But parathyroid hormone tells your kidneys to increase reabsorption of blood calcium. Remember, we saw that in the kidney chapter. We increase reabsorption of blood calcium. So blood calcium levels stay elevated. But it tells your kidneys to actually secrete blood phosphate, not reabsorb anymore. So that blood phosphate, even though it temporarily rose at the bones, once we get to the kidneys, those blood phosphate levels drop, which is what is really the big picture. So blood calcium levels overall rise, blood phosphate levels overall drop. In addition to raising blood calcium by breaking bone down and by telling the kidneys to reabsorb blood calcium, it goes a little bit further. Vitamin D. Well, parathyroid hormone enhances vitamin D activation at the kidneys. Remember, the kidneys activate vitamin D that was made in the skin? Well, parathyroid hormone enhances that. It tells the kidneys, hey, activate vitamin D more. Vitamin D is required by the small intestines to absorb calcium from your diet. If we did not have enough vitamin D, any calcium that's in our food or drink pass straight through our body and leave in the feces. But by increasing vitamin D levels, activating it at the kidneys, calcium then is absorbed from our food at the small intestines, and our blood calcium levels rise even further. So parathyroid hormone really raises your blood calcium. Doesn't do so much for blood phosphate because it has the opposite effect. It gets rid of blood phosphate, or it lowers blood phosphate. All right, so that is the end for thyroid, parathyroid. Let me wrap it up with this image that was from our old textbook, and it goes way back to the skeletal system, and it just kind of pulls together the effects of calcitonin and parathyroid into one image. This is our classic negative feedback loop for two things working against each other to maintain calcium homeostasis. When blood calcium levels rise, the thyroid releases calcitonin from the parafollicular cells, or the C cells. Calcitonin levels rise, which stimulates the osteoblasts to make bone, which then lowers blood calcium. When blood calcium levels drop too far, the parathyroid glands release parathyroid hormone, which stimulates osteoclasts to break bone down. Blood calcium starts to rise, and then we're back here. So we're constantly going through both sides of this. Now, even though blood phosphate is playing a role in both cases, it's really about calcium. All right, so we will wrap up there, and next class we will talk about the adrenal gland, and after that we will have one final lecture over the pancreas and then some other hormone producing organs. I will see you next time.